The members of this very special club are arriving at Westmead Neurological Centre in Sydney for one of their meetings. The membership is small and exclusive, but nobody wants to join, because to belong, you have to suffer from one of the worst diseases, perhaps the worst disease that exists. That disease is motor neurone disease, or A.L.S. What makes this disease so terrible is that it causes progressive loss of strength of the arms and legs. Speech and swallowing and even breathing are finally affected. The victim may become totally dependent on others. It's not a rare disease. About 1 person in 14,000 has it. There's no known cause, and no cure has yet been found. But there's plenty we can do to help its victims and to speed research.
I've been very fortunate that I suppose it's my attitude is the main thing. It's sort of slowed it down a bit. I haven't stopped it, but I like to get around now and talk to as many sufferers as I can.
First, let's learn a bit more about the disease. French neurologists of the 19th century first described what we now call motor neurone disease. Professor Jean-Martin Charcot described the commonest form, known as A.L.S., in 1874. His patients had increasing weakness of the arms and legs, and of speech and swallowing. Less common forms of motor neurone disease had, however, already been described in the 1850s and 1860s. For example, in 1860, Duchenne described patients who had progressive weakness of only the muscles of swallowing and speech.
It took 50 years or so for us to realize that motor neurone disease is really a family of diseases, of which A.L.S. is the commonest example. The central problem is a progressive degeneration of those nerve cells which take messages to the voluntary muscles. As these nerve cells, called motor neurons, degenerate, the patient becomes increasingly weak.
To understand what happens in motor neurone disease, it's essential to know how the brain sends messages to the muscles under voluntary control. The nerve cells responsible for muscle contraction are located in the motor strip. Within the motor strip lie the nerve cells which send messages to the limbs on the opposite side of the body. Let's consider what happens when a person flexes one arm. In the act of swallowing, motor neurons of the brain send their impulses to lower centers in the brain stem. The electrical impulses then travel to the various muscles involved in swallowing. Now let's have a closer look at the nerve cells responsible for muscle contraction, or motor neurons as they're called. Each neuron has a central portion called the cell body, and a number of special processes, each acting like an antenna, to receive incoming signals. The neuron passes its impulses along its long cable-like extension to the next neuron. The motor neurons, whose cell bodies are located in the spinal cord, send their impulses directly to the muscles, causing them to contract. When the impulses stop, the muscles relax. The motor neurons in the brain send their messages to the motor neurons of the spinal cord along pathways called the lateral corticospinal tracts. As the motor neurons, whose fibers form these pathways, degenerate, the lateral corticospinal tracts also degenerate, hence the inclusion of lateral in the term amyotrophic lateral sclerosis.
The average time of survival from diagnosis to death is 3 years. And the tragedy is that throughout this time, the patient's mind remains perfectly clear and alert.
Stephen Pegg's illness lasted 3 years, but despite his increasing weakness and loss of speech, he was able to set out his thoughts and feelings for his daughter in Just Some Stories for Eleanor.
I can't wake you with a kiss each morning, trace my fingers round your face, rub your nose. I can't carry breakfast to your bedroom, squeeze an orange, slice bread, butter your toast. I can't stand and watch you in the playground, chasing Amy, racing after Vicky's friends. I can't cuddle you if you stumble, or be waiting at the gate when school ends. I can't live trapped with my dreams in a single room while you and the world are out there dancing. I can't tap my feet, waiting for you to come home with a secret for me, whispers between friends. I can't wake you with a kiss each morning.
It's such a terrible disease that we just have to find the cause so that we can devise some effective form of treatment. But first, let's take a close look at A.L.S, the commonest form of motor neurone disease.
Amyotrophic means wasting of muscles, and lateral sclerosis comes from the pathways of the spinal cord that are affected. In A.L.S, as motor neurons degenerate, fewer impulses reach the muscles, so their strength decreases. Some muscles are especially affected, such as the shoulder muscles.
Colin, can you lift your arms up above your shoulders as hard as you can and keep them up against me? Hard.
Similarly, especially affected are the muscles which extend the elbow and the muscles which extend the wrist. In the lower limbs, the muscles that flex the hips and lift the feet in walking are especially affected. Muscle wasting. The second main feature of A.L.S is wasting of muscles. When motor neurons degenerate, the muscle fibers that they supply degenerate also. Notice how the muscles of the hand have become wasted in this A.L.S patient. The tongue may show wasting and fine, flickering movements may appear. Muscular fasciculations. As the muscles degenerate, little twitches called fasciculations may be seen. Problems with swallowing and speech. Where the motor neurons of swallowing and speech muscles are affected, the patient has difficulty in swallowing.
How long have you had A.L.S, Colin?
It was diagnosed.
It was diagnosed in March last year, but I think it had been coming on for some time.
What are your main problems now?
Speech, difficulty with swallowing. I have to eat and drink very slowly. Breathing a bit difficult. Walking, I cannot walk.
How do you overcome the problem with your speech?
Oh, I just battle on. People have got to be patient. I don't blame anybody. Patients with the A.L.S form of motor neurone disease who lose their speech entirely may not be able to write either because their hands are so weak. They may be helped by portable communication devices such as this, where only very light finger pressure will tap out a message.
Good morning.
This patient is totally unable to talk and is too weak to use the hands. But he can speak with a voice generated by a computer, operated by the slightest pressure on a knee switch.
We've looked at what happens in A.L.S, the commonest form of motor neurone disease. Now, let's touch on some interesting facts about motor neurone disease in general.
Incidence of A.L.S. In many countries, the incidence or number of new cases diagnosed has increased in recent years. The 1990 figures indicate an incidence of about 1.8 per 100,000 in Western countries. Prevalence of A.L.S. About 1 person in 14,000 has the disease in countries such as the UK, the USA, and Australia. It is by no means rare. There are certain regions of the world where A.L.S occurs more frequently. These pockets of high incidence have caused a great deal of interest in research workers. These regions are a small area in Japan on the main island of Honshu, 2 native villages in West Irian, the Northern Territory of Australia, where Aboriginals living on Groote Island and the adjacent mainland are affected, eastern Siberia in the Viliusk region, and the island of Guam in the western Pacific. The most intensely studied area of high incidence has been Guam, where at the start of World War II, the native Chamorro people had an incidence of ALS almost 50 times higher than the population of the US. Researchers think that the diet may have been responsible, because there has been a dramatic decrease since then, as the native diet has been replaced by a Western one. There is a big effort being made to see whether the people in these areas of high incidence are being exposed to some common dietary or environmental factor which might be destroying their motor neurons. Heredity and motor neurone disease. In most cases, motor neurone disease is not hereditary. About 5% of patients do have an hereditary pattern, and then the disease usually follows what is called a dominant pattern of transmission. That is, when one parent is affected, there is a 50% chance that the disease will be passed on to a son or daughter. We're now trying to locate the gene responsible so that patients with the hereditary form can be identified. The worldwide fight against motor neurone disease. Around the world, groups of patients and their supporters have come together to raise public awareness of motor neurone disease and to raise funds for research.
He's going to stay the night, isn't he? Are you back again?
Yeah. Well, do you want to come and help me move those sheep? I've got the big red there and the dogs on the back.
But let's not forget the real people who are fighting this disease, such as farmer Phil Retallick, who still manages to run his farm outside Canberra. An Australian farmer is used to hardship, and Phil is handling his problem with typical cheerfulness and courage. Motor neurone disease needs all the publicity it can get. So when Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York, visited patients in Sydney in November 1990 as patron of the English Motor Neurone Disease Association, everyone was delighted.
Research is good. Research is good. We've got to be yes, I can shout to the world about this disease. There's a lot of things that you wanted to say which you couldn't. And I can be your voice, because I can go around and let everybody know exactly how awful this disease is. So the most important thing is to remember that when you're feeling isolated and alone, I haven't forgotten you, and I'm out there fighting for you.